Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Gabbitas, Artistic Director of Phoenix Chorale, and I'm delighted today to be doing a Zoom chat with composer Christopher Tin, all the way from California. Hi, Christopher. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I am well, thank you. And the reason that we're speaking is that Phoenix Chorale next weekend, March 9th and March 10th, in Scottsdale Center for the Performing Arts, down in sunny Arizona, are performing your beautiful work, The Lost Birds, alongside Mozart's Requiem. And I wanted to just ask you a few questions about your process as a composer, the values and the vision that you had for this piece, and maybe just dive a little bit into your style and your motivation for what you do. So first of all, how did you come to write this beautiful piece?
Um, I first became aware of the topic of bird extinctions about 10 years ago when I was scoring a documentary about a sculptor who was memorializing extinct bird species by creating these giant bronze sculptures and placing them in the last known locations of these birds. And it was a very haunting topic. And as so often happens, is one of these things where, once I really sort of got into the emotion of the loss of these species and the sort of stunning visual imagery of this documentary, like the melody started flowing. And after I finished that documentary score, I knew I still wanted to say more on the topic and to compose more around this topic of biodiversity and species extinction. And so I conceived of this choral work, The Lost Birds. But it took about 10 years to actually bring it to the world because I was busy doing other things, frankly. But then when the pandemic hit, I was thinking about projects I could do while the world was essentially shut down. And it had just so happened that I'd been in touch with the British vocal ensemble, Voces 8, and we were discussing possible projects, and I floated this one by them as a possibility, and everyone seemed to like it. And so this was our little pandemic project in a way.
That's wonderful. Actually, it's always good to hear some positive stories of any kind that come from what was a very difficult time for humanity. And I certainly think it was an era which we'll look back on as, I hope, a time when we've reset our own sense of place in the world and realized that, no matter what we're preoccupied with as humans, the rest of nature goes on regardless. And I think one of the texts that you set, which is Sarah Teasdale's There Will Come Soft Rains, it sort of alludes to that point within the context of conflict and war, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, that was a poem that was written, during First World War, but it resonates today. I mean, we are, as some might say, on the precipice of another world war, or the possibility certainly exists. And of course, we our headlines are basically flooded by bad news every day, everything from, pandemics to global warming to all these other issues. Um, Sarah Teasdale, what she wrote and the way that she wrote it, this haunting poem where nature goes on and nature just basically forgets that mankind ever existed. It was a stark reminder of where we sit and the fragility of our place on this planet.
Yeah, and that was the text, and those were the particular lines which really got me thinking about how we could pair your piece with uh, another work which was contrasting but yet complementary. And I mean, I did so by looking at the Mozart Requiem, which is so full of hubris and the idea that as humans we matter so much, we make our mark on the planet, and even after we're dead we want these masses to be sung to pray us to heaven, and we want to have some sort of legacy and a lasting effect on humankind, whereas we don't even look after the flora and the fauna and the bird life and the animal life and all these incredible species that exist around us while they're still alive. And so for me, that line in the poem, they would scarcely care if we were gone, referring to the natural world. That was a really sort of sit up and think moment when I compared the arrogance of humankind against the wonder of nature, which is oblivious to our existence in so many ways. And I wondered, I mean, we've spoken before about this, and did you want to convey the warning signs that sort of come across through the extinctions of these birds? I think you mentioned it being the sort of the canary in the mine or something similar to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in familiarizing myself with the topic, the metaphor of the canary in the coal mine kept popping into my mind. And if you don't know the metaphor, it basically is that 19th century coal miners would bring a canary in a cage down the coal mine with them. And if the canary died, it meant there was a buildup of poisonous gases in the mine shaft, and the miners had better evacuate, otherwise they would be next. So in a way, this work is a sort of metaphorical representation of that particular metaphor. It's one where, you know, we mourn the loss of these birds, but as the piece goes on, you start to realize that what we are in fact warning at is the loss of humanity as well, our own species. So you're absolutely right. It is sort of a warning that the fate that befell these birds is sort of a harbinger for our own fate.
And as the sentiment behind the piece continues, because it's sort of 11 movements or so, but the first half of the movements are very much in praise of the birds, aren't they? And the second half of the movements, as you said, they feel much more like these warning signs. And fortunately, we're very fortunate to be the first ensemble, I think, to use the visuals that you've worked on and commissioned from Audubon's wonderful book. At least some of the etchings are from the wonderful Native Birds of the US book. And could you speak to those visuals and what the audience can expect to add that extra media element to the performance?
Well, yes. I mean, for me, text is very important. And actually, the ability for listeners to parse text is very important. It doesn't always come across in choral settings, but just because of the nature of the medium. But once you understand the words and once you can hear them sung, you do get a lot more meaning. And so I created this slideshow, basically, with imagery by James J. Audubon, taken from his Birds of North America book. And basically, the entire uh, libretto, if you will, of the work is projected so that the audience can follow along, but not be distracted necessarily by motion graphics or moving images. It's just there so you can hear what's being sung, so you can sort of like take in this extra layer of meaning that comes out of the words.
Yeah, and I think it works really well because the second half of the visuals is much more of the stark photographs as opposed to the beautiful bird etchings. And as you move through the piece, you get much more of a sense of the emptiness of the world post life, and much less of the sense of the celebration of the world of the world full of this bird life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you're absolutely right in that the first half very much celebrates the beauty of these birds because you can't have a sense of longing and regret without first celebrating what it is that you're going to miss the presence of in a way. So it was very much set up that way. First half celebrates the beauty of birds and birds are plentiful. Second half mourns their loss and the birds are gone. And soon we ourselves are gone.
Yeah, and so that's the premise of the piece, and but it's actually very uplifting and very joyful in so many ways. And the way that you weave sort of leitmotif through the piece, there are elements where there are little quotes from each of the preceding movements at the end of one of the movements, about two-thirds of the way through the piece. It's very, very cleverly done, and indeed there are returning motifs in the final few movements which hark back to the longing and the yearning that we felt for these incredible birds at the start of the piece. And it's all wrapped up in this beautiful harmonic language. I remember when we were first in contact was back in 2022, and you kindly wrote me an email. And this is something that composers have to do, isn't it? You always have to sort of cold call artistic directors and ensembles and institutions to say, hey, here I am, here's my music, what do you think? And I listen to everything that comes to me. And I heard your piece and I got in touch with Voces because I've been fortunate to be a trustee of Voces 8, and I've been fortunate to be on their artistic advisory committee for a few years now. And we spoke about this project, and it became incredibly exciting to me. I was just waiting to see what I could pair it with. But the reason it spoke to me was that the music was so instantly accessible and enveloping and beautifully crafted. And I think, what would a first-time listener to your piece, what would they experience when they first heard Christopher Tin's Lost Birds?
I would hope a lot of emotion in a way. I mean, what I do try to write very melodically. I really try to go for, those memorable tunes, right? And The Lost Birds is full of them, like all of my works. I think that perhaps there's a intensity of emotion that you get through the work. It's deeply melancholy in a lot of ways and profoundly sad in a lot of ways. There is a very sort of almost like an operatic structure about it with the recurring motifs, and the story that it tells. And I would hope that first-time listeners would get something out of the experience of being there in concert with you. Just a sense of empathy, is in a way that is all I can really ask for. I mean, I talk about other artists who work in sort of like, the environmentalist space in a way. And, I'm of the opinion that every art form has its unique strengths in terms of advocating for a certain cause. So a documentary, for example, might be really, really good at explaining the nuances of a particular issue, whereas a piece of music isn't great at explaining nuance, particularly scientific or technical knowledge. But what it is good is evoking a sense of emotion about the topic. So if nothing else, I hope that people do get a little bit sort of lost in the experience.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned advocacy. I think this is very much the soft power of advocacy that you display in your writing, because it feels to me like a wonderful on-ramp or a gateway for people who might necessarily think that they like classical music or they want to come to a classical performance. And I was in Arizona last week speaking on television and on radio about your your work and your style in this particular piece. And I was saying to the interviewers, this is a concert for people who don't like going to concerts and don't like classical music. Come one, come all. This is the sort of material where Mozart Requiem is full of tunes and you will have heard them before without realizing it, and you will recognize them. Christopher Tin, it's a brand new piece of music, but again, it's full of tunes that you will know, even if you've never heard them before, but they so neatly arc to where you want them to go. There's resolution in each phrase. The harmonic language is very, very consonant. It fits with where intrinsically and very viscerally we want music to go, and it touches us in a way where we want to be touched by music emotionally. And so as such, I think it's very, very persuasive. So the rhetoric which is behind the deeper meaning, I think, comes over loud and clear, particularly when we've got the surtitles, the text on the screen behind. But yet, even though you write wonderful tunes, and they remind me very much of the sort of folk melodies and that Second English Renaissance style of. There are some moments which feel very reminiscent of Finzi's writing, for example, and bits of Vaughan Williams and bits of Parry and Elgar, that whole school from about 1880 to 1940, which I know really well and grew up singing all of these things. And that makes me feel very, very nostalgic and wistful for a harmonic language. And that nostalgia in me allows me to tap into the nostalgia for the birds themselves. So you're very cleverly picking through your well-crafted musical language. You're picking at our heartstrings and getting us to empathize with your advocacy position as well.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned Vaughan Williams because, at a certain point in his life, because he's known for cataloging and orchestrating a lot of folk tunes, there came a certain point where his own melodies almost became indistinguishable from folk tunes in a way. The rhetoric just sort of worked its way into his own vocabulary. It's no accident that this work sort of harkens to that era because that was, as you mentioned, or as we've talked, the golden age of sort of folk song preservation in a way, where musicologists were going all across, the United Kingdom, but also in North America, just cataloging folk songs. But it was also the golden age of ornithology, and it was also the Industrial Revolution. And these sort of like signposts directed me towards a harmonic language that should sound evocative of that era. So, in a way, the language that I choose to employ on any given work is sort of dictated by what I want to communicate by that work. So this is one of my more pastoral pieces in a way.
And I'm glad you used that word, because my next question to you was going to be the fact that we've almost got this battle between the lush, expansive, filmic string sound, which goes back very much to the work you've done in franchises such as the Civilization franchise, and we get these wonderful pieces from you that our that viewers of this interview might know, such as Baba Yetu, for example, which is an unmistakable harmonic language and very, very pastoral. But you interestingly bring in some percussive elements to the orchestration as well, through the timpani and the chimes and the harp and the glockenspiel, the marimba, and so on and so forth. So is there almost a battle between that pastoral string sound happening with a percussive element of industrialization, or something which beats against that wonderful green and pleasant land which I know in England?
Actually is, the introduction of this element is more for a variety of tonal color. I mean, while I do believe that the basis for that sound is a lush string sound, heavy on vibrato, right? Um, you need those punctuations in a way. They're like glimmers of light that sort of poke through the fabric in a way of both the choral and the string sound. The choral and the string sound blend so well, in terms of the envelope of the instruments. They sit together so neatly. And in a way, the strings are sort of just an expansion of what the voices can do. They bring the register both lower and higher. And they fit like a glove. But sometimes you need that extra element of color, whether it's a slight timpani roll just to push into the next moment, or, a few light touches on a glockenspiel or a harp. Those are the types of color that I really crave myself when I'm listening to a work. I like a variety of sonic experience. And those are all instruments that have a complete opposite envelope. That's the term that we use in music. They have strong, crisp attacks and a sort of like a regular decay after these moments punctuate. And that's a well-needed contrast. If we're talking about the construction of music, it's really helpful to have these contrasting elements to keep a piece alive.
It's beautifully balanced. I mean, I was rehearsing last week, and I think more than anything else, I requested the strings to play in a passionata mode. I just wanted them to have that wonderful depth of vibrato, and particularly when the higher strings went quite low, where the first violins were down amongst F, E, D, around middle C. I wanted them to have even more bite and more power to them, because there's that yearning feeling when high instruments go low and when low instruments go high. And so that was a wonderful sort of upsetting of the buoyancy of the ship, if you like. But that's what really started to grip my heart. And there were another few moments which I really appreciated as a conductor, where you flipped the balance and you made the voices the accompanists just on vocalized vowels to the orchestra, and the orchestra was the primary force. They were the soloists, they were the ones in the foreground, and the singers, I was saying, no, you have your purity of vowels, but you just get on with what you're doing, because the orchestra is, prime focus at that point. What was it that made you think of sort of flipping that light and shade?
I mean, the way that I construct my works is I'm very much both performer oriented and audience oriented. I mean, those are the two main things for me. Write a work that performers love to perform and that audiences love to hear. And part of that goes with giving everyone a moment so that they can really dig in. I wanted the strings to have their moment, to step forward and sort of soar in a way. And they have a lot of those moments. They even have their own instrumental interludes within this work. Likewise, with the vocal writing, I mean, I just wanted to give everyone something, anyone I could possibly give a moment to really to shine in a way and to step out from the crowd. I really wanted to do that. It's just a way to keep the sound alive and to keep your ears fresh, and to give listeners a way to never be bored by something. I just do not want anyone checked out at any given moment while listening to any of my works. And sometimes that just means we've been listening to this sound world for a while, and now here's something else. Now we're going to flip things. Now we're going to do something different. It's just the nuts and bolts of the music, composition, art, and craft in a way.
Yeah, and across that spectrum of color, we touch virtually every part in the spectrum through the piece. There are wonderful a cappella movements which have incredible vulnerability and poignance to them. And then there are expansive sections where we have the entire percussion section, the entire string section, and all the voices joining in one massed voice in praise. You can almost feel like they turn into a migratory flock of these birds, and they take flight and they soar through the atmosphere and the acoustics of the space in which you are performing. And then there are other points where we just have the harp providing color, almost like raindrops and a sort of a pizzicato feel, of course. And then other points where the suspended cymbal prestiges an enormous rise in the shape and the structure of the entire piece. And I think, I would encourage people who do listen to this piece to identify these different moments and to realize, okay, the piece is, 45, 50 minutes long, but in fact, there is so much intricacy and filigree and contrast and nuance within that. There's a particular movement where the instruments are imitating the bird song, and there's something happening in every point of every subdivided beat of every measure. And there's just so much to think about. And the score is an absolute work of art in itself. The joy that I had in just turning the pages, and with orchestral works, you need a big paper score. You can't use a digital score. And it's wonderful to be forced to go back to first principles and to feel the paper and to look at this intricacy of writing. And it's, you've given us a real work of art in lots of ways. I'm sure it was enormous fun to do.
It was enormously actually challenging to do. I mean, the topic matter, the subject, I do immerse myself in the subject matter that I'm writing for. I mean, it's impossible in a way. You sort of take on the issue internally, and it was very, very hard to do, especially since the state of the world in which I was writing, during which I was writing, was in itself apocalyptic in a way, right? We were all shut in because of this rampant virus running around the world. So, I mean, every work has a different sort of gestation and birth.
Yeah.
This one was a lot harder and less joyous just due to the subject matter of it. It was cathartic in a way to wrap it up and release it out into the world. And now that it's being picked up, by choruses such as the Phoenix Chorale, I mean, it's gratifying to find that, these birds have landed in a way, that the story has resonated and that people are actually enjoying performing it.
It's good. So it sounds like you're very much sort of a method composer. You really sort of get into the rhetoric of what you're. I like that. I think that's really interesting. Well, the world is certainly very, very glad that we have this beautiful piece. And congratulations on the success so far. I was nominated for a Grammy with that Voces 8 recording. And you're a multiple Grammy Award-winning composer. So the world knows of you, but it will know of you even more. And I'm so glad that in our sector, we're able to give flight to your wonderful music and to present it to different audiences around America. I know the Arizona audience is just going to adore it. I know there are multiple performances happening around the nation, and they will continue around the world, I'm sure. We feel very privileged in Phoenix that I think we're either the first or one of the first to be doing it with the full complement of a full chorus and a full orchestra, and indeed with these wonderful visuals, the projections that we're going to be using as well. So this is a sort of a premiere performance in some ways, and we're delighted that you've entrusted the honor of doing that to us. We're very grateful to you. We're sure the audience is going to love it. We're sad you won't be there in person, but we hope to see you in Phoenix at some point in the future. And we're so grateful for your time today. Thank you so much, Christopher Tin. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's great to chat with you.